I've been talking to Stacey, as you know. I talk to everybody. And I've been working across the aisle with all the Republicans trying to get people to understand that that's the bedrock of our democracy. An accessible, fair, and basically secured voting. That's it. To have, and right now in a divided country, this is not about me. It's about our country. People better start looking at how did we get to where we got to January 6th, and why don't we want to fix it?
You think you can get Republicans to vote for the reforms
I hope.
Have you talked to Republicans?
I talked to everybody.
Who said they would support it?
Well, I've talked to everybody. And you know that basically Lisa Murkowski signed on to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act with me. So that's a start. And the bottom line is you just got to keep working. You can't give up on this stuff. And you just can't separate our country any further.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Johnson in for Nicole Wallace. It's 5 o'clock in New York as American democracy hangs in the balance. Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia spelling out that the bedrock of our country, free and fair elections, is under attack, all because the former president's big lie and the ensuing assault on democracy by Republicans through the passage of voter suppression laws. The solution? The For the People Act, federal legislation passed by the House way back in March that would make changes to campaign finance, voting, and ethics laws. Senator Manchin was for it before he was against it. Now he's for it again. Manchin co-sponsored the For the People Act in 2019, or S1 as it's known in the Senate, then stood against it for much of 2021, saying he would not accept any measure that isn't bipartisan. Yet this week, the senator flipped again, showing immense flexibility. Manchin put out a list of provisions he could accept to pass the bill. Some of those include making Election Day a public holiday, mandating at least 15 consecutive days of early voting for federal elections, banning partisan gerrymandering, and requiring voter ID with allowable alternatives to prove identity. Manchin's proposal was well received among some Democrats and some voting rights activists, even getting the support of Stacey Abrams. Yet there's still a massive hurdle to overcome before the legislation can pass: the 50 Republicans in the Senate. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer will put the bill to a vote on Tuesday. It's all but guaranteed to fail. As the New York Times reports, with Mr. Manchin suddenly within reach for the Democrats, Republicans on Thursday escalated their attacks on the voting rights bill, portraying it as a power-grabbing abomination. They were not impressed by the West Virginians' tinkering. Though some Republicans have previously expressed willingness to talk about Mr. Manchin, about a potential elections compromise, it seemed impossible to imagine even a few, let alone 10, of them siding with Democrats on a measure that's eliciting this much wrath. All this boils down to the fact that without eliminating the filibuster, Manchin's compromise will likely prove fruitless, with prospects for meaningful voting rights legislation looking dim. Attorney Mark Elias stresses there is no time to wait. He writes, quote, "Elections have consequences, and without fair voting rules in 2022 and 2024, the consequences may be a permanent loss of democracy. We do not have the luxury to wait until sanity returns to the Republican Party, Congress passes new laws, or the majority of the Supreme Court changes. While the American people continue to raise their voices and push for reforms, we need voting rights lawyers to continue to show up in court and tell the stories of American citizens whose right to vote is being threatened. For now, democracy remains on the docket." The fight to protect our nation's democracy is where we start this hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Judith Brown Deanna, civil rights attorney and executive director of the Advancement Project National Office, is here. Also with us, Cliff Albright, co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund, and Sam Stein, White House editor for Politico and MSNBC contributor. Thank you all so much for being here. We're just going to start right off. I want to play some sound from some Democrats who were very, very happy about Joe Manchin's proposals yesterday. And Cliff, I want your thoughts on the other side of this.
This is progress. And I got to tell you, I am so grateful for what Senator Manchin has done and what he's doing right now. He's trying to find a way to protect voting rights in this country at a moment that they're under attack in more than 40 states in the wake of an insurrection on the 6th of January that sought to overturn an election.
I think that is a positive step. Listen, you have to see the progress. Many of us thought he was a no, not only a no, but a hell no, but it seems like he has softened his stance and he's willing to work to find some common ground to move forward. We have a voting problem in this country, and that problem is that you got Republicans trying to suppress the right to vote in many of these states that we see around the nation. And so I'm heartened to see the discussion moving forward.
So, Cliff, I got to start with you. There's a lot of mainstream Democrats who are like, yay, say, yay, Joe Manchin gave us a list of things. And there are other individuals in the activist and voting rights community who are a bit concerned. How do you feel about the enthusiasm that some Democrats are already showing for what are just proposals on behalf of Joe Manchin?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me. I've got to say, I'm very concerned about that level of enthusiasm. I don't share that level of enthusiasm. First of all, yes, it's undeniable that we're in a better place today than we were 11 days ago when Joe Manchin did his op-ed saying that by no means was he going to vote for the For the People Act. So yes, we're in a better place. With that said, though, this is still far short of what H.R. 1 protects. There are still very important protections in H.R. 1 that Joe Manchin is not supporting, making it easier for those with previous convictions and who are impacted by the justice system to get their rights to vote. He doesn't protect. Making it harder or blocking people that are trying to do these conservative groups that are trying to do voter intimidation type voter challenges. He doesn't protect, even though H.R. 1 does. So there's some critical provisions that his proposal does not protect. And then there are some things that he's proposing that for some places are actually a step backwards, right? Imposing voter ID, even with the exceptions, but imposing that on a state that doesn't have it and which hasn't had any problems, that's a step backwards for some states. So I'm concerned about the level of enthusiasm, if for no other reason, because it's a horrible negotiating tactic. But at the end of the day, yes, we're in a better place than we were 10 days ago.
Sam, I want to go sort of more specifically through this list. So there's great stuff at the top, right? There's like, hey, we're gonna make Election Day a national holiday, and we're going to give people the opportunity, 15 days of mandated early voting. That's actually an improvement in several states. But then you get to some other suggestions here, which would allow states to still maintain voter rolls, which many people interpret as the ability to continue to purge voter rolls at the last minute. You also have suggestions about getting rid of or severely limiting access to no excuse mail-in ballots and absentee balloting. Sam, when you look at this list, what part of this do you think is Joe Manchin thinking, and what part of it might be what he's just throwing out there to make some of the Republicans happy?
Well, my focus immediately goes to the voter ID elements that he introduced. Basically, if you believe that the past election, 2020, was not fraudulent, there's no need necessarily logically to introduce a voter ID law into a bill. But if you believe that you want to get Republican voters on board for some sort of comprehensive legislation around election and voting reforms, then that's the type of element that you throw into your negotiation. Now, of course, he did caveat it by saying you can use a utility bill as a form of identification. We do have some voting rights advocates like Stacey Abrams saying they're comfortable with that. But to me, that's Manchin making a concession and designed to win a Republican vote. And what's telling is it's not going to win a single Republican vote. So what does that get him? It gets him the ability to say he tried. It gets the Democrats the ability to say, okay, we have 50 members potentially for this. I doubt it gets him or it gets him to the point where he's willing to scrap the filibuster. But it does set up a sort of political dynamic in which the Democratic Party can say, we made this concession that Republicans were asking for. They did not go for it. Now we need to find other ways forward to protect the franchise and or use it as a cudgel to go after Republicans for not protecting the franchise. So my focus is squarely on that voter ID element that Manchin latched onto.
See, this is what's interesting to me when Democrats make this argument. It's like, hey, we tried. No, Mitch McConnell said, I'm not going to work with you regardless. Like, I don't know why Democrats seem to want to negotiate with people who don't want to negotiate with them. You don't negotiate with terrorists or terrorist sympathizing parties. Diane, I want to ask you this, because this is something else. This is some sound that I think also indicates bad faith negotiating on the part of the Republican Party. This is a quote from Senator Roy Blunt about who was involved in trying to put together these new suggestions.
Well, I think every one of us looks for opportunities to work with Senator Manchin, and we found those opportunities. I actually think when Stacey Abrams immediately endorsed Senator Manchin's proposal, it became the Stacey Abrams substitute, not the Joe Manchin substitute.
So there's 100 different ways that I can think of unpacking this. But when you hear that, what is Roy Blunt doing by randomly throwing Stacey Abrams' name into something that we all know that Joe Manchin has been working on potentially for months?
Jason, we don't have enough time in this show to unpack everything in that statement. First of all, throwing out Stacey Abrams' name was clearly a bullhorn to the Republican Party about the fact that Black folks need a compromise. But, let's put this in perspective. This compromise was dead on arrival. They never wanted to be for it. At the end of the day, and I want to add to this, it's not just voter ID, but if we look at some of the things that he recommended, it's really about what goes to the heart of the Republican Party, which is states' rights. Mitch McConnell is clear, like the feds do not need to be in the business of protecting voting rights. That should be left at the state level. And what he did in his compromise was that he would weaken the Department of Justice authority to be in the middle of these voting rights fights. And we know that the Biden administration just said that they were doubling the number of lawyers in the voting rights section. And for us who are voting rights lawyers, we need the federal government on our side. And I want to put this in perspective because the urgency is here. The House is on fire. We have a Supreme Court that's getting ready to decide a very important voting rights case, which could kill the Voting Rights Act in the next couple of weeks. Redistricting is coming up in the congressional elections in 2022. And so if they don't do anything now, we are in trouble and democracy is in trouble.
Cliff, I want to go to you on this because I'm very bottom line about what's important about these bills and when these bills actually matter. You are out in the streets. You and Latasha Brown are traveling around the entire country. You see what's going on. Obviously, the Democrats are not going to be able to get everything that they'd like. The progressives aren't going to be able to get everything they like. But by the end of this year, what has to be passed at a federal level in order to have a puncher's chance for remotely fair elections in places like Georgia, Florida, and Pennsylvania next year, from your perspective?
Yeah. So first of all, you've got to have more access to the voting. Some of the things that even Manchin is supporting, right? The expanded number of days for voting, make it easier. Restrictions on closing polling places. So all of those provisions are important. I really think that something that's missing is that there's got to be a provision, which I don't think was thought of when HR 1 was originally passed, but this issue of overturning elections, which has become increasingly important over the past couple of months, right? That's something that is a trend in all of these state bills. It was in Georgia, it was in Florida. They tried it in Texas and failed. We see what they're doing in Arizona. Whatever the final version is, has got to include something around that. And if I could just say something quickly about this issue of compromise, right? Because as Black folks in this country, whenever we see in Black history or American history this issue of compromise, usually we're on the short end of the stick. 3/5 compromise, right? Missouri compromise. If you don't know it, just go Google it. But you can't compromise when one side is not dealing with reality, right? They're dealing with a lie. If I'm negotiating with my child over whether to get a dog or whether to get a unicorn as our pet, I can't compromise on the unicorn because it's not real. And that's exactly what's happening in this situation. He's compromising on a position that is simply not based on reality.
Yes, I enjoy any My Little Pony references and unicorns during the show. Sam, I want to play you this sound. This goes exactly with what Cliff is talking about here. So you have this situation where overturning elections is the goal, right? You have a lot of Republicans who just want to make it hard to vote. But I want to play this sound about what happened with Mike Pence earlier today when he was speaking to a group of conservatives.
And I want to thank my friend Ralph Reed for those overly generous words. I'm deeply humbled by them. Ralph Reed knows me well enough to know the introduction I prefer is a little bit shorter. I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order.
Sam, people are screaming traitor at Mike Pence, the guy who 6 months ago people were trying to hang. If this is the feeling of the Republican Party, that he's considered a traitor because he wouldn't break the Constitution in order to throw the election for Trump, is there any way of any type of negotiation that could happen at the Senate or even at the state level if this is where the core of the Republican Party and conservatives are?
Well, first of all, Cliff just blew my mind about unicorns. I had thought they were real until this moment. So, Cliff, you destroyed my mind there. As for the Pence-Trump thing, look, this is not obviously a Republican Party. This is a Trump party. If you think of the Faith and Freedom Conference, I don't know how many if any, you all have been to over the years, this is the sort of ideal setting for Mike Pence. I mean, these are the people who he appeals to the most in the conservative movement. For him to be heckled, and admittedly, it wasn't like the full audience was heckling him, but it was heckled. For him to be heckled like that and called a traitor goes to show you the totality with which Donald Trump has taken over the conservative movement and republicanism. This is not a party. It is a cult of personality that's geared towards Trump. So to answer your question, the only deal you can really cut under those circumstances is a deal that Donald Trump would essentially say is okay, right? I mean, he would have to give his stamp of approval to something like that. And what we know about Donald Trump right now is that his intense focus, a paranoia of sorts, is on voting and making sure that the election is cast into doubt. And so I have some serious doubts myself that Donald Trump would ever sign off on any voting rights legislation on the federal or state level unless it went totally towards the way of casting doubt on the 2020 elections.
And Diane, I want to close with this because this is important. So we got to look at the White House now. We've seen what's happening in the Senate. We've seen what's happening at the lower level. Vice President Harris has been deployed. She has been parachuted in to try and spearhead some of these voting rights efforts. What can she do? I mean, at a practical level, this obviously shows that Joe Biden cares and the whole administration cares. But is there some unique skill set or ability to negotiate that Vice President Harris might have, or some expertise she might have that makes her a good point person for the battle for voting rights?
Well, I mean, I think a few things. One is that she was a senator. She has relationships there, not just on the Democratic side. So the idea is that she understands that process. She knows people in the Senate, and that she has always been kind of a voice of reason also. And so the idea is that she's in a very good position to help negotiate, to help move Manchin and the GOP. And so, and she's, you know, she knows voting rights. And so I think she's best positioned. And I think that the president was right to put her up front on this issue. But we'll see. You know, it is not looking good. And we will see next week where people stand and whether or not they are ready to protect our democracy.
Judith, sorry for getting your name wrong earlier. Happens to me all the time.
Diane, you know, I get it, Jason. It's okay. It's Juneteenth, brother. I'm letting you go.
Exactly. We're all free today. Judith Brown, Diana, Cliff Albright, and Sam Stein, thank you for starting us off on this hour.